This is Unit 2, the Media of Art, Lesson 7, Painting. Painting describes the characteristics of paint and the various painting methods that artists employ. The process of painting is not changed over time, but the materials and techniques have. Today, artists have many more pigments available to them than they did in the past, as well as a wider variety of binders, vehicles, brushes, and supports. This lesson describes each of the different types of paint: watercolor, oil, acrylic, and fresco. Depending on what choices the artists make among these materials, they can achieve an almost limitless variety of effects. The objectives for this lesson are to distinguish the pigment, binder, vehicle, and support in painting, compare the characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages of paint media and techniques, define terms used to describe painting processes, materials, and effects, identify representative works of art to show characteristics of each medium, and contrast the use of airbrushes and animated pictures to traditional painting techniques. This lesson will be covering ingredients and surfaces, watercolor, fresco, encaustic, tempera, oil, acrylic, and contemporary approaches. For the most part, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the paint type and technique that is used in most of these slides that we'll be seeing. This one may be pushing those boundaries a little bit. It's a oil painting by Gerhard Richter. It's an abstract painting from 1984. Even for me as an artist, it's not particularly evident what type of paint he used right off the bat when I look at this image. So this kind of shows you that paint can be pushed and pulled into different directions. Just to reinforce what we went over in the introduction, we're going to go over the three components of paint again, which are pigment, binder, or the medium, and vehicle. Pigment provides color, usually exists in some type of powder form. Early man ground up different types of minerals, and plant juices dried them out basically to get early pigments. Binder mixes with the pigment to hold the pigment particles together and to attach the pigment to a surface, and vehicle spreads the pigment. The first type of painting we'll be discussing is watercolor. Watercolor paintings are made by pigments suspended in a solution in water and gum arabic, which is a resin from the acacia tree, to white paper. Usually this paper has some type of texture to it to help with the absorbency of the water. Watercolor is basically a staining technique. If you look at this painting, the areas that weren't touched by any watercolor are actually the brightest. The darkest areas have the most pigment in them. The watercolor is so translucent in this painting that you can see the pencil marks underneath. This is a modern watercolor painting based off of Chinese traditional watercolor painting, which is done with black and brown ink. In this, however, we have some highlights in watercolor. It's much more fully realized than standard traditional Chinese watercolor painting. We'll examine this tradition closer later on in the course. Fresco. True fresco, also known as buon fresco, is finely ground pigments suspended in water that are applied to a damp lime plaster surface. Fresco secco, which is dry fresco, is done on finished dry plaster walls. Fresco has the tendency to last an extremely long time, as we can see from the ancient examples that still exist, but they have to be done very rapidly. Normally large frescoes are done in small little segments in order to let everything dry. Sometimes your plaster can dry within a half an hour, so you have to finish that particular section first. As stated before, fresco has its roots in ancient times. It was also used during the Renaissance, which really looked back to those ancient times, particularly at the Greeks and the Romans, for inspiration. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci used it in the Last Supper. It was also used by Michelangelo for the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. With the popularity of oil paint, it kind of faded into obscurity, and it was revived during the 20th century by artist Diego Rivera. Here is a full view of a mural by Diego Rivera. What's interesting about this mural is Diego Rivera was a known communist, and it wasn't really frowned upon necessarily in the United States during the 1930s, but it's amazing that this mural actually stayed up over the years, especially during the McCarthy years in the 1950s, when they were investigating artists and musicians, filmmakers, and the such for being communists. Another painting technique that has its roots in ancient times is encaustic. Pigments are dissolved in a binder of molten beeswax. There's no vehicle because the wax is sufficiently fluid. Our next painting method is tempera paint. Today, water-based paints such as poster paints, children's paints, or paints with binders of glue or casein, which is a protein that is found in milk and used independently in many foods as a binding agent. In ancient times, the principal tempera medium has been egg tempera. Egg is actually the binder. Tempera paint actually has ancient roots dating back to the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. And artists in the Middle Ages perfected this technique. In order to get the colors bright like this on wood panel, the artist traditionally with tempera and with other paints has to cover the panel first with a paint called gesso. It's a chalky surface. You can kind of think of it as like a primer. One of the techniques used to get rich color in this painting was called overpainting. It's successive layers of translucent paint. The layering of the paint like that creates strong and vibrant colors. The next painting method we will be looking at is oil paint. Today, with oil paint, pigments are mixed with linseed oil from the seeds of the flax plant. Back in the Middle Ages, pigments were mixed with vegetable oils, namely walnut and poppy seed oils. Oil painting has been one of the most popular forms of art since Renaissance times. One of the early masters of oil painting was Jan van Eyck. He really laid the groundwork of the possibilities an artist could achieve when using oil paint as a medium. He used glazes, which are thin layers of oil paint, to achieve the bright and vibrant colors. Also, he was a master of texture. If you look, we have velvets, different types of fabrics, skin, hair, cement, paint, gold, all these different textures. We'll be looking at Jan van Eyck later, and particularly examining one of his paintings closer up and really dealing with the texture as well. This is an oil painting titled Rembrandt's Indulgence Was Van Gogh's Dilemma from 1991. And it's a fun little poke at two of the most famous oil painters around, Rembrandt and Van Gogh. The technique that is this heavy layering, thick layering of oil paint is titled impasto. Unlike glazes, it's a different type of layering to where you're trying to really pile it on, and the paint does in general have to be thick. You just don't thin it as much with linseed oil or whatever you're using to thin your paints out. And you can really pile it on top. Sometimes paintings can actually take quite a long time to dry when using this technique. Artist Joan Mitchell also used oil paint in this painting. Mitchell uses color to convey a sense of emotion, which we've talked about before in the use of color. The paint is also used to create abstract forms. She intended both of these to work in harmony with each other in this painting. Acrylic paint is our next painting method. With acrylic paint, pigments are suspended in acrylic polymer medium, which provides a fast-drying, flexible film. Most acrylic paints are water-thinned, but they become water-resistant when dry. This slide here is of a sculpture, but it is painted. It's titled Return from 2004 by Anne Truitt. I find it kind of interesting that your text chose to exemplify this as an example of acrylic. Now, this was done in the exact same manner than any type of painter would, where there's different layers of paint The only difference is here she's allowed to kind of sand the surface as you would with wood. Previously for this course, the examples of acrylic that were used, and also the cover of the last edition, was by David Hockney. We just looked at one of his drawings in the drawing lesson, and he was very well known for breaking ground with acrylic paint. He's always known as using modern materials, so this is very much a modern piece as well. But instead of your standard enamels that you would picture wood being done with, the artist chose to use acrylic paints. We're going to be finishing off our lesson on painting, talking about contemporary approaches to painting. The airbrush has been around for the past several decades. It always hasn't really been associated with fine art, although there are a few artists who do dabble into it. But this artist, Kelty Ferris, who used it in this painting from 2012, used different types of paint in a airbrush, oil, acrylic, and she also used some pastel, was actually a drawing tool, to apply paint to the surface. Now, when you use an airbrush, you're using a compressor with a series of different tips that are applied to a hose. The compressor presses air through the tip, and you can control it actually usually with a little screw that's on it, the amount of air that comes through, so you can get really fine lines or a fan of paint. Now, this is really unique looking in the context of airbrush. Airbrush has always had the tradition of being used kind of on t-shirts and automobile art, but artists are trying to challenge what other artists have done with the medium. This image here is a still from a digital animation by Jeremy Blake titled Sodium Fox from 2005. The entire length of the video is 14 minutes and it's on a continuous loop, so it would start repeating itself again after 14 minutes. This was created by using film footage, still photography with hand-painted elements, and assembled in an editing program to create essentially a moving painting. Some people refer to this as animation, but it is definitely crossing all boundaries and really bringing contemporary ideas to painting. This was the last image for Lesson 7 Painting. Thank you for listening.